Welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky.
I'm Stephen Zuber.
And we have a special guest with us. Are you going by Tailcalled? You're Tailcalled on our Discord.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go by Tailcalled. Some people call me Tail for short, which I guess is kind of strange given the name, but yeah.
All right, then Tail or Tailcalled, you are from Denmark, and you are one of the leading researchers on AGP, which is what we're going to be calling it because it's much easier to say than autogynephilia. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Well, also gynephilia.
Gynephilia, okay.
Also, quick meta note that Jace is around somewhere, and hopefully he'll be joining in the next few minutes. So that's where he's at.
Yes.
I delivered that really well. Good job, Stephen. I'm on a roll so far.
If that happens, we will do a quick pause for introduction.
Yes.
But autogynephilia is a word that I just learned a few years ago, and I was surprised this was a word that existed because it seemed to me like a word that didn't need to exist in the same way that we don't have a word for humans who have skin. Because you don't need a special word for humans who do have skin. But it turns out I was wrong about that.
Yes. So I guess I should describe it. So that is a common assumption. So autogynephilia describes someone's sort of attraction to being a woman, sexually attracted. This, like other sexualities, involves sexual fantasies, which can take on many forms, right? Often it's about you are a woman and then you do something in the fantasy, or you get transformed into a woman, or you might be interested in cross-dressing. There's a lot of things that we can get into.
Is this a state of affairs or condition or whatever you call it that just affects men? Biological men, whatever.
That is a great question, which I think a lot of people are feel a lot more certain about than I do. So I am not gonna answer it, but I think we can get into the reasons for or against later. But it's at least most discussed in men, right? Because it's unclear if it even matters in women in a sense, right? Whereas in men, if you find it erotic to be a woman, then that is gonna lead to a lot of it's not necessarily gonna lead to a lot of issues, but it's at least a contrast to if you are a man. Of course, that's one of the big controversies because it was actually coined in the context of transsexuality or like trans research, because a researcher named Ray Blanchard argued that it is one of the major causes of transsexuality.
Just to shine a light longer on the point or on the distinction there for a second. So one might say that male to female transgender, a man's desire to become a woman, that could be from like, this is how I self-identify, this is the true expression of myself, or someone, I forget whose name you just said, could say it's because I find the idea highly erotic.
So the self-identity concept and so on, that is sort of the thing that trans people tend to give as the reason, whether or not they are autogynephilic, at least, according to the standard theory. I should probably name the standard theory. So there's sort of two camps, right? There's what's sometimes called gender identity theory or something like that, where, the only reason that one would end up trans is because of sort of an innate feminization in some sense. It's kind of vague. But then on the opposite side, we say, okay, maybe there are psychological reasons that are not just, a magic gender essence. And autogynephilia would be one. But then it's not necessarily that gender identity is the other, because, what is gender identity? So the Blanchardian theory instead says, okay, we have autogynephilia on one hand, and then effeminate homosexuality as another one. Now, I have a lot of problems with both of these camps, so I am sort of a weird person to talk about this. But I think I would agree that this notion of gender identity is, to a large extent, something that like it's sort of complicated. When I was introduced to trans topics, so I'm also gynephilic, and I've sort of been on hormones. I'm on hormones, and I haven't really properly transitioned, so I'm in a sort of weird in-between state. But when I was sort of introduced, I was told that gender identity is the same as wanting to be a woman, right? And insofar as that's the case, then it's not so much that autogynephilia is an alternative to gender identity, but more that it's a cause of it. But that's very much a framing thing, and nobody is really combining the two theories anyway, so it's not necessarily something that makes sense as a framing.
It seems very strange to me to say that autogynephilia would be a reason to transition, because then wouldn't we expect like the vast majority of males to transition?
Yes.
I mean, okay.
So
I'm thinking
no.
that.
So there's many. So I guess the starting point is so I guess there's two parts of it, right? How many men are autogynephilic, and then how many autogynephiles transition, right? And why is this the case, right?
Well, and autogynephilia might be a spectrum of like 0 to 100, right?
Yes. So
and only if you're super into it, is it worth the transition?
Those are important questions.
I had always assumed that the rate of autogynephilia, again, I didn't know that there was a name for it because I thought it was just 100%, is basically 100%, as evidenced by the fact that lesbian porn is so popular. Is this not the case?
See, now we're getting into a lot of things, right? So the thing about lesbian porn is that it's not just autogynephilic men who find it erotic. So a lot of straight men who are not autogynephilic in any sense find lesbian porn hot just because, it's two women. What's not to like?
There's twice as many boobs and no cock in the way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so it's not that lesbian porn is necessarily the absolute indicator of autogynephilia. So there are definitely autogynephiles who are fans of it, but there are also many straight men who are not autogynephilic in any way who are very big fans of it. So that's where we get to, I guess that's one of my favorite ways of investigating, who is autogynephilic or not, right? That's if you have some hot sexual fantasy, right? Are you then the woman in that fantasy, or are you the man? How often are you the woman? Because if we ask, how many men are autogynephilic? Well, what does it mean to be autogynephilic? It's a definition question, right? And there's a lot of philosophy that can go into it. But what I tend to find is that there are a lot of different sort of sexual interests that are sort of correlated. So the simple one is, you find it hot to imagine yourself as the woman in these sorts of sexual situations, right? Then there's some other things. So autogynephiles often have sexual fantasies where they, start out as a man and then transform into a woman through magic or something like that. There's actually whole porn genres about that, and that is sort of more exclusive to autogynephiles than the whole lesbian porn or whatever. Not totally, but mostly, I think.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about that second kind.
What was the second kind? I didn't quite catch it.
It's called transgender transformations. Depict, say, some man who, gets into some shenanigans, and then suddenly, magic happens or technology happens, and then suddenly she's a woman now.
Okay. Oh, and you said this would be a kind of a genre that would be more indicative of AGP.
Yes, in the sense that, there would be very few non-autogynephilic men who prefer that genre.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. There's controversy as to whether or not this is a cause of transgenderism?
Yes. I don't know if we should start with or finish the point about the prevalence first.
Sure. Let's hold on to the prevalence then.
Okay, so the prevalence is sort of hard because, as Stephen said, in a sense, it's a spectrum. Like, if you consider something like gay men, there's sort of a clear separation. I mean, there's bisexuality. There's all sorts of interesting things that can be said about bisexuality. But there is a sort of bimodal distribution among men where you have some men who are very clearly gay, and so then you have some men who are, not very clearly gay. And you don't get this nice bimodal distribution with autogynephilia. You get more like, some men are, I guess, if I was a woman, then it would be hot to, look at myself naked in the mirror or whatever, right? And then, you have some who are, every single sexual fantasy for their life has, involved being a woman. And then, you have some in between, right? and it's not like there's sort of a clear bump, at least not in any data I've seen. Then with the prevalence, there's also another difficulty. So, we might imagine, okay, we ask men, for instance, how many of your sexual fantasies do you imagine yourself as a woman, right? And I bet if we did that among your viewers, right, then I bet we would find that 50% of your viewers, of your male viewers, say, I never do that, and then the remainder 50% are relatively evenly spread over all orders of magnitude of frequency.
Is that just like for demonstration purposes, or is it literally like 50% of men have no AGP at all?
So it is literally that, but it is literally that in certain kinds of samples. I usually say it's that in online samples, because that's where I've seen it. Like if I ask on Reddit or on Astral Codex 10, or I've seen some people ask on Facebook. I have no idea why it would also be on Facebook. I mean, you could sort of say, oh, Reddit and rationalists and so on are weird people, right? But Facebook, I have no idea. But studies on online samples, as I say, they tend to find that, maybe it's like 30 to 70%. It varies. And then again, we have to remember, not everyone in this are equally autogynephilic, right? If we take the ones where it's, their central sexuality, then that's maybe 1 in 10 of those. And there are some studies that have attempted to recruit representative samples, and they've generally found it to be maybe 3% to 15%. So that's much lower, and that's why I'm sort of distinguishing, because the most obvious thing would be to maybe just trust the general ones to be more representative and say, okay, it's 3% to 15%. On the other hand, I've seen some people say, well, maybe normal people are not admitting to it. It's hard to know.
Has this been studied long enough that they know this is a steady rate, or has it fluctuated over time?
So it fluctuates, from study to study, partly based on the methods and partly based on the sample and so on. But I don't think there has been any sufficiently sort of repeated samples that you can say, oh, we have seen this to increase or decrease. But there are some new studies that get low rates, and then there are some old studies that get approximately the same, but they're not directly one-to-one comparable. I've sort of been thinking that I should do a study where I take all of the different ways that people have tried to estimate the rates, and then see how they rank relative to each other, right? Like some might get higher or lower, and then we could sort of place all of these scales, all of these different methods on sort of a common scale based on that, maybe. But it's always somewhat questionable when you're overly clever with math, right? So
yeah,
I had a bit of a realization on something I was thinking about earlier, which was kind of some of the competing hypotheses about this might be that some men would transition because of like their innate gender identity, and then others would transition because they think it would be really hot to be a girl, right?
it's not the theory.
No, but I mean to be unfairly simplistic. But I guess I realized that I'd set up that as a dichotomy, and there's no reason it should be. If you feel like I'm a woman and you currently don't present as one, and you want to publicly and physically identify as one, of course you'd feel like more sexually excited by that, right? You're like, now I finally get to like enjoy to look at in the mirror,
So
I think that makes sense.
Now we are getting to sort of the controversy about why would people say, oh, it's not a cause of transsexuality, right? Because there's a lot of thought about, does the causality run in the opposite way, right? So that's most obvious in the case of the lesbian porn thing that Annie has mentioned, right? Like if you just sort of take the standard male sexuality and then you say, oh, you want to be a woman instead, right? Then you end up with something that could be said to be lesbian, right? So people could question the direction of causality there.
Everyone wants to be a hot lesbian, right? But there's some people who are saying that AGP would not cause people to transition.
Yes. So the starting point would be to say, okay, if you ask AGP men, right, do they want to be women? Then, a lot of them will say, no, I don't. I mean, I'm fine with being male. Being a woman would be hot, but being a male is great too. And, if there are many AGP men who don't want to be women, then could we really say that AGP, causes you to want to be woman, right? That doesn't seem to match with the base rate.
Gotcha.
If you then further add, hey, wait, doesn't it seem like, you could have it go the other way around? Then actually we have a non-trivial causal inference problem here, right?
What's the other way around?
There are a lot of different theories for the other way around, actually. So the simplest one is just if you hate being male and you really want to be female, right? Then it makes sense that you would also hate being male and really want to be female in sexual situations, right? But then there's actually two additional theories, right? So it gets back to what Stephen asked about in the beginning, namely, are any women AGP too, right? Where some people feel that female sexuality in various ways resembles autogynephilia. So they will say things like, oh, women like to dress up sexy for their partners, and a lot of people would say, wait, isn't it that women do it for their partners? Then you can talk with women about it, and some women say, well, of course women are AGP, and some women say, no, what the heck are you talking about? And I am very confused about this point.
I'm a little confused here. Wouldn't a woman that's AGP basically be someone who feels sexy in her body?
so that's a common critique of the sort of on both sides, right? So one side says people are just judging trans women for feeling sexy in their bodies, right? Honestly, I don't necessarily want to say that I know the answer to all of this. I think there are some very difficult questions because how do you define or measure EGP in cis women? And yes, you sort of get some similar difficulties with what's the relationship with gender identity, right? So my approach tends to be to say, okay, can we throw some of the things we know about how to do causal inference at it? But I guess I should mention a sort of third theory that people also mention, which is that people think that a third way that transsexuality or gender identity you could cause AGP is by repression. So it's a theory I call the masochistic CEO theory, because often it's phrased as if you have a highly stressed CEO who he has to repress all of his relaxation because he has this very stressed job, then people think that he becomes masochistic and wants a dominatrix so he can release control. I don't buy masochistic CEO theory at all. I don't think it makes sense that sort of if people want something and are repressing it, then it automatically becomes sexy. I don't think people have given good evidence of it.
You said this was controversial, this idea?
Yes, absolutely.
So the trans community rejects the idea that AGP could cause transition?
Well, so
or what is it they reject?
It might be good to sort of put it in the bigger perspective, right? So it's not so much that they reject the idea that AGP can cause transition. Like they tend to say, if that's how you self-identify, then that's up to you, right? But the concept of AGP is not just something that exists in a vacuum, right? There are certain groups that talk about it, right? And the most obvious place to start would be with the clinicians who sort of pushed the AGP theory, right? According to Ray Blanchard's research, there are two types of trans women, and at the time only two, though he is open to the possibility of rapid onset gender dysphoria, but that's not necessarily going to make trans people more happy about it, right? So let's focus on the two types. There's autogynephilic trans women and homosexual trans women. His theories don't really cover trans men. Like that's not what his research focused on. So
he should just fully commit to the bit and be like, "What? Who's there? Who's saying?"
So I wouldn't say that he doesn't believe trans men exist. Like he wrote a book about I think it was called something like treatment of gender identity disorders or something, right? And
I do have a quick question before we keep going with that, though. Is that as we zoom out, is this guy's presumption maybe then that there are two separate causes of like distinct causes of transgenderism, and one would be male to female, one would be male to female to male?
So the idea is that among trans women, there's the majority who would be called autogynephilic transsexuals, who are attracted to women and who are sort of more masculine, who are often fetishistic, and who sort of transition later in life. And then the other group is what he calls homosexual transsexuals. They are attracted to men, and already there you sort of have a problem, right? Because trans women identify as women. They wouldn't like to be called homosexual if they're attracted to men. They would like to be called heterosexual, right? But that's the name he gave them in his theory. So homosexual transsexuals would be attracted to men, and they would be feminine, and they would transition younger. then the claim would then be that most trans women are autogynephilic transsexuals, and as long as a trans woman is attracted to women, you can safely infer that she is autogynephilic, and that's sort of especially where the controversy comes, right? So it's not so much the trans community doesn't want people to identify as autogynephilic or to say that's what matters for me. It's the trans community does not like that these clinicians are dictating you transition because of autogynephilia and not because of your innate gender identity.
So why does anybody care? Like, just transition or don't transition. And I mean, it might be interesting research to find out why someone is motivated, but it doesn't really matter in the end, right?
That's sort of where all the other groups come in, right? Because one of the other big groups that talk about autogynephilia, that's what's called trans exclusionary radical feminists or gender critical feminists. These gender criticals, they don't like trans women. They are basically saying, we need to take away trans women's children because they're going to abuse them and stuff like that. Okay, so now I'm making them seem entirely unreasonable, and of course they are entirely unreasonable, but at the same time the opposite side can also be entirely unreasonable, and gender critical feminists, they also have some entirely reasonable points, such as maybe a subreddit for lesbians should not say that you are transphobic if you aren't attracted to trans women.
Okay, I guess the reason why it might matter if you are one type or the other is because if you're still attracted to women, they would not want you in their bathrooms, I guess. But isn't that just, it feels like it's just kind of standard homophobia if someone's got the full transition.
I mean, there's a lot of complications, right? First of all, a lot of gender critical feminists think if you are autogynephilic, then that must mean that you are, sexually attracted to being a woman. So that must mean you really like your penis, which
I don't understand how that follows.
I don't think it follows very well. What tends to happen, right, is that the gender critical feminists will go and take the very most aggressive, most problematic trans women, and then they'll say, look at how all trans women are like. They're all, evil autogynephiles like this, right? So in online communities, autogynephilia can sort of function as a boogeyman, right? Like it's those crazy people who want to come and rape you and, stuff like that, right?
Okay, I see. So we're okay with the like effeminate homosexual from very young age people, but we really don't like the transitioned older in life people.
So then there's also a sort of third group within the trans community, right? There's always going to be the discussion of should we sort of push harder and be less conformist, or should we try to be very nice and let others decide how transness works. And what often happens is that sometimes some random person will go into a trans space and then make a giant post complaining the trans community has been taken over by evil autogynephiles, and back in my day, everyone was blah 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 blah. If someone then decides to stink up a billion posts about that and dominate the entire community with that, then you also got a problem, right? So there's very few individuals in the trans community who, openly identify as autogynephilic, right? So they can get away with stopping these sorts of posts just by saying, you're not allowed to talk about autogynephilia, right? But then that's sort of a complicated thing, actually. What do people identify in private versus in public, right? Yeah, it's definitely a huge mess, right?
Well, I now understand why there is this controversy. I guess, what do AGP people do about that? Just pretend they're not? Or
I don't think we actually finished the discussion about the causality.
I don't think we even started on the causality. I assumed it was just like being gay. You just, this is an attraction you're born with, more or less.
Right. There's the question of, what causes AGP, right? And then I guess there's the question of what are the effects of AGP. I guess, okay, I say that because, I subscribe to the idea that AGP is mainly the cause of the associated gender issues and not the way around.
So I assume what causes AGP is just having eyes and being able to tell that women are sexy and awesome. but
So-
perhaps I'm wrong about this.
Well, and quick note,
So-
cute isn't the only definition of attractive, right? Chris Hemsworth
And-
isn't cute.
So I think nobody really knows what causes AGP. I mean, we don't even know what causes, transsexuality, right? Or you can take homosexuality, right? Nobody knows what causes homosexuality, but it's actually been studied, unlike with AGP, where nobody has studied what causes AGP. I mean, I sort of get the feeling that academia is sort of a wasteland, right? Like,
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
to some extent, obviously, if it's going to be politically charged, then people are going to be less inclined to study it, right? But at the same time, there's not so much funding, and the people who study things, like, even if they studied it, they would not necessarily get good results. And
Yeah, if you do study it, you don't get published. If it does get published, the place gets boycotted. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not just a question of publications, right? It's also a question of a lot of social scientists don't really know what they're doing.
So your research, for the most part, has been published online, and I don't know, promoted. How you have to just talk with other people yourself, right? There isn't really a venue for this.
I mean, I haven't really gone out of my way to promote it unless it's sort of been relevant for some discussion somewhere, right?
Have you gotten blowback by researching this from organizations or people?
That's the sort of funny thing. I haven't really gotten all that much blowback. I mean, sometimes people figure this is, AGP, it's this evil thing, and then they leave an angry comment, and then I say, oh, but, I am not this evil thing. So, then it usually goes well. So I've seen, researcher Michael Bailey do research on the same places, right? And he gets enormous amounts of blowback. And I think it's partly because I try to be nice, and he does not try to be nice at all. Of course, that then raises the question of, to what extent is that because of his IRB, right? Like, maybe they say, oh, you have to inform people that you are this evil person and stuff like that. I think I have a good understanding of why you get these differences, and the sort of multiple overlapping factors that sort of get mixed together. The major one is collider bias. So the idea is, if you just look at autogynephilic men in general, then they are, as far as I can tell, basically, well, not entirely, but in pretty much any way that you can immediately think of, that they are going to be basically like ordinary cis men, except they are much more likely to want to be women. As I mentioned, a lot of them don't, right? But they're much more likely. But then there are also some males who, for whatever reason, want to be women without being autogynephilic. Now, what happens if you look at either trans women or, more broadly, males who have some sort of gender bending thing, right? Because, not everyone transitions, right? But if you do somehow filter for those who are somewhere on the trans spectrum, then what's going to happen? Well, we know that we have this group of autogynephilic males who are not all that distinct from other males, who are going to be much more likely to be in the group, right? And you might also have some who really have some sort of strong femininity, or so I want to say strong femininity, but I think there's a lot of complexities there, but I don't think we can fit that all into the Discord. Let's just say they have some issues with gender roles, right? So they really don't fit in as males, right? Now, usually there would be no correlation between autogynephilia and fitting in as gender norms, because, autogynephilic males are basically the same as others, except they want to be female. But if you filter to those who have gender issues, right, then you eliminate those who are, completely normal, who don't have any femininity, and who don't have autogynephilia, and who don't have anything else. So what you're left with is a very strong negative correlation between autogynephilia and whatever else might cause a man to want to be a woman.
So the ones that do transition are the ones that have both autogynephilia and other things as well pushing them.
That's what I believe. You have to consider not all autogynephiles even transition or want to be women, right? So
I think the vast majority don't transition.
Yes. So the vast majority don't transition at all, right? You can just sort of think of that from the numbers, right? Like, if 3% to 15% of males are autogynephied, but 0.5% or much less than that. I mean, the numbers differ a lot, and they've been growing, and that's its whole other own problem.
Yeah, like I would never transition until we have full post-transhumanity morphological freedom, because like with the current tech, I would just make a really shitty, unattractive woman, and that would suck. So I'm not going to bother.
Yes, so that's sort of part of it, right? This sort of negative association. Another big part, which I think is possibly even more dominant, is homosexual males, like androphilic males. And I keep saying males because I sort of want to talk about both cis men and trans women, and but yeah. So homosexual males, they are usually much more feminine than, well, there's lots of exceptions, overlapping bell curves, all that, blah blah.
Yeah,
you sort of got this separate group, which is sort of fairly cleanly separated, and it's been thought that maybe they transition under different circumstances too, like that they primarily transition in low socioeconomic status. And there's a lot of discussion about that, which is not entirely clear, right? But so, for instance, this is actually where one of the sort of most important practical points come in, which is some people think, okay, we have ordinary cis men who are happy with being men and so on, right? And then we have autogynephilic trans women or trans lesbians, or whatever term you prefer, who are they seem to be not as feminine and so on as the androphilic trans women. So to a lot of people, that makes them sort of less trans, right? But there's some important complications to that, which is a phenomenon known as desistance. So the idea is you can find, some very little boy who is often goes very, oh, I want to dress up as a princess. I sing, I'm a Barbie girl, and, only wants to have female friends, can't stand boys, and who really wants to be a girl, right? People might naively look at him and then say, oh, that's someone who's going to grow up to be trans. And this is someone who is much more trans than, those autogynephiles. But if you sort of actually look at it, then what often happens is that they desist. So they just become happy with being gay men as they grow up. So you can find a lot of gay men who will say, when I was a child, I dressed up as a girl, blah, blah, blah. And that means that it's not simply that they are more trans, right? It's something more complicated. And if there's one thing that's sort of important from the typology in practical things, then I think this might sort of be it. You might have someone who is very overtly feminine from a very young age, where one might think, oh, that's the typical trans, or like soon to be trans. But, then actually he grows up and is a happy gay man. So it's not that this is necessarily a strong indicator of adult gender identity, whereas you can have someone who, like me, I showed no signs in any way of being girlish in my childhood, but I guess I have more gender issues than many gay men do, many more.
Yeah. Is there anything to be done about this, or is this just an interesting fact to consider about humans? Because until we get full morphological freedom, it just seems like, well, okay, I guess grow up and do the best you can with what it turns out to be you are.
Of course, that's like the controversial thing, right? Because the trans community will want to make transition more widely available for teens, right? And that actually means that today it seems like there are quite a few autogynephiles who transition in early puberty, and that is something that some of the original Blanchardians, some of them are very critical and say, we are, expanding it beyond what can be reasonably diagnosed. A trans woman who is called Anne Lawrence sort of considered this to be the best case, like if you could expand it so transitions would be accessed early for autogynephiles. The big names within the Blanchardian community would generally be opposed to it, but how much of that is because that's what the theory says, and how much of that is because it's the people who are more critical of trans people will also tend to be the ones who adopt these unpopular theories.
Why would the Blancardians be against people transitioning at a younger age?
That comes back to the issue that you are expanding transition for individuals who might be able to grow up to be happy as gay men. There's sort of a few different ones, right? So This researcher called Michael Bailey, he's sort of one of the leading ones. He says that he doesn't really think that autogynephiles actually care about passing that. And I think he's, completely crazy about that. You can sort
That
of
sounds
say
ridiculous.
that. Yeah, exactly.
That's the entire point.
So it's sort of, he's sort of you call me the leading researcher in the start, right? But, he's sort of I guess we could call him the second leading researcher. But credentially, more people would, of course, respect him than would respect me because, he's a big university professor and, he's had decades defending this and so on, right? But, it's ridiculous. He's totally clueless, right? And that's sort of what I'm saying about academia is sort of a wasteland, right?
I don't understand. What could he possibly think trans people want to get out of transition if it isn't passing as the sex they wish they were born in, I guess, if that's the way to put it?
I guess that there are several paths to it, right? So the first is that, unfortunately, a lot of trans women don't pass, right? A second factor is that he doesn't have straightforward access to trans women's entire histories and especially, their private sexuality, right? Obviously, the simplest thing you could tell about a trans woman, does she pass? So,
well, the thing is, if they pass, you can't tell they're a trans woman,
Well, it depends because, activists and so on who say, I'm trans and...
Okay, sure, yeah. But in general...
there's a lot of things to be said about that, right? But the point is sort of, autogynephilic trans women seem to pass worse than androphilic trans women. And I don't actually know why. I've seen some theories like autogynephilic trans women transition later, but Michael Bailey would say, well, it's because autogynephilic trans women don't, to the same extent, decide to transition based on whether they could pass. That's what he writes in the book. That clearly doesn't apply to all autogynephilic trans women, and the autogynephilic trans women who do transition without passing, they will still say it would obviously be much better if they could pass. So I think he's just clueless.
Yeah.
When Blanchardians think of autogynephilia, they don't necessarily think about, I fantasize about being a lesbian. They think you have some man who wears, a lot of fetishistic clothes and maybe pretends to be pregnant and uses tampons and stuff like that, which is it's sort of a very different presentation than the one we discussed in the beginning. And I ought to think that it's a combination of autogynephilia with various sorts of fetishism and possibly other things. That there's a lot of people who believe that autogynephilia is very closely correlated to masochism, right?
I didn't know that. Is that a thing Blanchardists believe?
Yes. There are various pieces of evidence that people might cite for that. So, for instance, I think there was a study where they took men from a cross-dresser club and compared them to men from various other sex clubs and found that the men in the cross-dresser club were much more often masochistic. In a sense, it's sort of a very natural connection to make if you look at many of the presentations that autogynephilia has in the media. But when I then looked at it statistically, I found that there was no connection between autogynephilia and masochism after adjusting for general unusual sexual interests. So it's a weird thing where what people see in various anecdotal situations does not necessarily match what people see in, or at least what I see in statistics.
You said, actually, I think this was before the podcast, but you said that you split with Blanchardians a while ago. Was this one of the things that caused you to split? The fact that they were mixing up these masochism and...
So by that time, I think I had already split quite a bit. The thing that was the biggest or like most central part of the split is about something called meta-attraction or pseudo-bisexuality. The old school Blanchardians call it pseudo-bisexuality, but 4chan decided that the pseudo was offensive. So, okay, let's start with what is it? There's a lot of autogynephiles who are, totally straight and who say, I'm not attracted to men at all. I'm attracted to women, right? But they find it hot to be a woman and then have sex with men. So this meta-attraction or pseudo-bisexuality, it's that autogynephiles can find it attractive to have sex with men as a woman or while cross-dressing or things like that, even though they are not in a classical sense attracted to men. And that's sort of a very controversial idea, right? Because people say, wait, isn't that unfalsifiable? Like that they're having sex with men. What more could you want? So I actually think that Blanchardians have a good point here that meta attraction is but what they then tend to say is, oh, meta attraction is the only possibility if some autogynephile expresses something that resembles attraction to men. There's no bisexual autogynephiles. There's especially no anthrophilic, like exclusively homosexual autogynephiles.
So wait, hold on. Meta attraction being the idea that you act out an attraction role without actually being attracted to something?
There's sort of a few different ways you could see it, right? But one of them would be you are attracted to being a woman who is attractive to men, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the precise feelings within it has been precisely studied. It seems to me that, different people will emphasize different parts of it. So I tend to say, okay, what are the phenomena that we focus on rather than the exact definition, right? And the phenomenon is an autogynephile who is not attracted to men, but who finds it erotic to have sex with men in some feminized position.
I'm also confused as to why that doesn't just count as being bisexual.
So that's actually a very interesting question. So if we go back to the case, most or like straight men in general like lesbian porn, right? And gay men like gay male porn, right? So you can sort of see what is a man's sexual orientation based on what sorts of porn he finds erotic. And the benefit of doing this is that you do not introduce the confound of saying, is he aroused by the people in the porn or by something else? So for instance, if you show gay men straight porn, then they will find it hot because there's a man in it. But they're not straight, right? They just like the man.
Okay.
So you need to somehow isolate the variables, right? And if you sort of try to isolate it for meta-attracted autogynephiles, then you say, here is some gay porn depicting some very manly, masculine, burly men. How hot do you find it? And not really. And so that's sort of a clean way to see the distinction, right? But of course, the question then is, what is the distinction in practice, right? For instance, one of the controversial things is like, does this have implications for relationships, right? And it's hard to tell, in my opinion, because I think that there are some autogynephiles who are attracted to men in the classical sense. There's, classically bisexual men who just happen to be autogynephiles. I also believe that some homosexual men can be autogynephiles. If you find an autogynephile who is in a relationship with a man and, it works fine, right? Is that because of meta attraction can work fine for relationships, or is it because this person is anthrophilic? I don't know. How would I know?
You said a homosexual person who's an autogynephile. Is that basically just the same thing as the early transitioning feminine case that was mentioned earlier?
No. They are sort of similar to how heterosexual autogynephiles are mostly indistinguishable from heterosexual men unless they transition or do something like that. Then homosexual autogynephiles seem mostly indistinguishable from homosexual men. Now, I don't know to great detail because it's not something I've researched very much, and there's not very many homosexual autogynephiles. But this is sort of where we get into the part where I split from Blanchardians, right? Because they will say autogynephiles can't be attracted to men. I mean, that's just what they can't, right? They will always attribute it to meta attraction. Whereas I think, sometimes it's meta attraction, sometimes it's not.
I have a hard time thinking of like when you say your stereotypical straight cis man, I totally see that. But when you say like your stereotypical gay man, there's like at least 3 or 4 types of gay people that I think of, with one being, the fabulous guy, but then I also think of like, the leather daddies and the bears and stuff like that. So I don't have a just typical gay male stereotype that I can go to. Is there one in particular you're thinking of, or am I thinking about gay male culture incorrectly?
So I guess I shouldn't claim to necessarily be an expert on gay male culture, right? But if you start with, an ordinary straight guy, right? And, then of course, he's attracted to men instead of to women, and, he has relationships and probably a lot of sex with men. And then his voice is probably noticeably, or like just on the edge of noticeably feminine. Like you might wonder, is he gay or is he just feminine, right? And his interests are also significantly shifted to he likes
Okay, so we're thinking more of the effeminate.
I mean, it's not that he's necessarily massively effeminate. I mean, there's a range, right? Some are very effeminate and some are not, right? So.
All right, I was just trying to get the image in my head here.
So it's kind of difficult, right? Because I tend to deal with abstract numbers like, we have 2 standard deviations of difference or blah blah blah, right? So how does one translate that to everyday experience, right?
All right. So looping back to my original question, you said something about like you split with the Blancardians because they were wrong about autoandrophilia.
Not really split. So autoandrophilia, right? That's one of the early things. So when I got started studying all of this stuff, I didn't actually get started studying all the autogynephilia questions in the beginning, because I was around, in the trans community in with Les Wrong, and like trans people in the rationalist community had their own things that they emphasized, and that's actually where I got started researching. When it comes to the rationalist trans community, then they didn't really talk all that much about autogynephilia, if at all. I mean, as Jace said, sometimes they did, right? But it wasn't a central thing. But what they noticed was there are so many rationalist trans women. And
it's one of the things we're famous for.
Yes. So what they actually had in terms of ideas was, maybe there's some sort of connection with nerdiness, right? Like a lot of trans women are famously nerdy computer people. I think it's something like, for instance, the processor architecture for many mobile phones was designed by a trans woman or something. I'm not entirely sure. But trans women have been noticeably nerdy for a while. And that's sort of what I was trying to study in the beginning. Is there some sort of connection between nerdiness and gender something? I spent some time on that, and I didn't get much. I mean, I got some. I think I got some weak, ambiguous signals, but it wasn't very clear. So at the beginning, I also engaged in various debates about trans rights and did some research related to that and so on. I actually did test for autogynephilia in one of my very earliest surveys, but I made a calculation error, which threw off the results to make it look like there was no effect. Yeah. But then, at some point, I met various people. Some of them prefer to remain anonymous, so I should not get into too much detail. But I sort of got a course correction where many of my misconceptions about Blanchardian theory and so on were corrected, and I started studying autogynephilia again, and then I suddenly got super strong results, way stronger than anything I had gotten while studying nerdiness. And that's sort of how I connected into that. But at the same time, I was doing surveys where, I just posted surveys in public forums and then got a lot of responses. So I studied both males and females, right? And I got lots of women who reported various forms of autoandrophilia. And, they also were much more likely to want to be male. So the entire notion that, it's only autogynephilia and not autoandrophilia that exists, I saw no reason to believe that. I mean, I got so many autoandrophiles. There was no shortage of them. There was a woman who was like, oh, yes, that's absolutely me. Here, let me give you, a very long description with, I've gotten a Paga and I like to suit and stuff like that. It's talking about, how it varies with hormones and so on. So she was not transitioning.
I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't be a thing. If there's one, why not the other, right?
Right. But I mean, the Blanchardian researchers are just, nope. When I've challenged them, they said things like, oh, I don't think that females can be paraphilic, or, they said, oh, I think that it's social contagion. They say, oh.
Wait, what is paraphilia?
Oh, that's a big question, right? So paraphilia is just sort of a euphemism treadmill for sexually deviant or perverse. Originally clinicians would diagnose people as perverse, but then perverse became a slur, and then they needed a new word to describe someone with unusual sexual interests.
Is this just another term for being kinky?
Sort of. I mean, I think kinky sort of more connotes BDSM, right? You can describe someone who like is really attracted to trans women as kinky, but it's sort of weird.
Okay. I always just assumed kink was anything that is outside of standard, straight missionary position,
Yeah, I mean,
simple stuff.
I also actually.
Maybe I am wrong.
No, so I actually sort of had the same tendency, but I sort of found that after some experience with it, that it seems to mentally correlate for people with the BDSM. I don't know. I
Okay.
can't say I can't say that I'm an expert in the exact labeling of kinky, but
Yeah. Well, I have no experience with the BDSM scene, so maybe that is the case.
of course the trouble with the term paraphilia is that it's very controversial. And the reason it's controversial is because, what is the archetypal example of a paraphilia? It's pedophilia.
Okay.
Right. We can list some more examples. Okay, how about exhibitionism, voyeurism? How about paraphilic rape? There are all of these sort of taboo sexual interests. Zoophilia, all of those, right?
And their claim is that women don't have those?
Yes, so at least for some of these, it's somewhat more understandable. So if you look at who gets incarcerated for rape, right, then it's 99% men or whatever, something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's because men are violent and aggressive.
Well, yeah, but the sex difference is bigger for rape than for other crimes, as I understand. I mean, it's some time since I've been running the numbers, but I believe it is bigger there.
Okay.
But I sort of agree that it's not indicative of a general tendency for men to be more paraphilic. And I think you can sort of think about it, right? So, okay,
I mean, I could totally agree that men are more paraphilic, but there's obviously women that are as well. Like, have they met more than a couple dozen women?
Yeah. I mean, so there's actually sort of a weird... Actually, let's start with the rape thing, right? So, because rape is sort of interesting. It's... If you just think about it for instance, from an evolutionary standpoint, then it seems to me that there would be more times where it's evolutionarily advantageous for men. And of course, that's not, that doesn't make it morally right, but evolution would sort of set the sex difference in a sense, right? You can also sort of think, okay, the stereotypical rape that you get arrested for, that's directed towards strangers, right? And who wants to have sex with strangers? Oh, that's men again, right? So you sort of got all of these specific factors related to these specific taboo paraphilias that would make them more male skewed. And I think if you look at some other paraphilias, then they're not necessarily. I mean, I think Ayla found that women are more likely than men to be masochistic or something. Different things appeal to different people. Who knew?
Right.
So they sort of have this strange assumption that also androphilia can't exist because female paraphilias can't exist.
That's okay. That just sounds like stupid.
I mean, there were the previous stupid things. So yeah. So autoandrophilia is the thing. When I began with all of this research, I sort of ended up in contact with Michael Bailey and all of these people, right? And I thought, okay, he's wrong on this autoandrophilia thing, but he's been right on a lot of things about autogynephilia. I didn't know all of... There are a lot of things I've since learned about with, for instance, the passing thing and so on. But at the time I thought, okay, I can probably explain to him if he gives me some time and so on. Actually, there's some point in this autoandrophilia thing, right? But he ended up, inviting me to various places. Like he has this mailing list called SexNet, and we've also discussed some research, right? But eventually, I think it became clear that he is just, not even trying.
So I guess the question now that occurs to me is I always simply assumed that AGP was at least a contributing factor to male to female transition, because it just seemed obvious from me based on where I was coming from. But like, how common is it the other way around, where autoandrophilia is a female to male conversion driver? Because I don't ever hear that talked about.
Yes, and that's sort of the thing, right? So it's strange because it doesn't get talked much about. But if I look at the numbers, like if I ask a bunch of women, hey, do you want to be a man? And, do you, are you autogynephilia? Then it seems like I get similar effect sizes. So, what's going on? And I think that one thing that happens is that all of these elaborate, very fetishistic forms and, things like forced feminization and so on, for whatever reason, they don't seem to show up as much among women, like in autogynephilia. So I wonder if there's sort of a tendency for it to be less obvious that, because a lot of people find that if you have some sort of autogynephilic sexuality that clearly differs from just the gender reversed, then they find it more credible that it would be the cause of the transition than the consequence. If a woman fantasizes about, having a penis and, using that for sex, okay, is that because she wants to be a man, or is it the reason she wants to be? Whereas, if you have some sort of elaborate gender transformation set up, then a lot of people find that more obviously causal. I'm not sure I agree with that, and there's a sort of a big complication with that. Causal inference is hard, and I thought a lot about it. But the point is basically, I think autoandrophilia might be look less weird to people.
Why do you think that would look less weird to people?
So I don't know what causes it to look less weird. It's just that if you look at the stories that people talk about with autoandrophilic sexuality and then compare them to the stories, then there's a lot of overlap between the stories, but most of the weird stories are from the autogynephilic males and not from the autoanthrophiles.
Maybe it's because tomboyism has already been accepted at least in Western European society for hundreds of years at this point, that it probably doesn't seem like as big of a jump.
That is a common hypothesis. There's also the hypothesis that Freud's penis envy concept, like that it ends up.
Okay.
No, but that someone might say, oh, I have fantasies where I have a penis. Why might that be? Oh, that must be the thing Freud talked about, right? And, it's not at all the thing Freud talked about. I think I think Freudian stuff is quite dumb generally, but
yes,
you can sort of see how it would sort of absorb the stories, right?
Yeah. So we're running late. I guess there were two things that I wanted to make sure we touch on before we wrap things up. You said much earlier in the episode while we were talking, but what is that gender identity anyway? And I don't know, we'll come back to that or something along those lines. And so I don't know, did you have a thought about what is gender identity anyway?
Right. I think the trouble is that it's one word that gets used to refer to many things, right? There's the whole child psychology thing where you notice that boys and girls at a certain age, boys will be all girls are icky, I don't want anything to do with them, and they will pay a lot of attention to men to sort of mimic the men.
Are there any boys that actually believe that, or is that just like a game?
I think I did a poll on it, but I can't remember the results. And
Stephen, are you still there?
Yeah, I was reading the Wikipedia page for some of this stuff, so I missed the last thing you said. But yeah, I've never heard of any of these people, and I'm blissfully unaware of all of the political history and stuff. And so, as you guys are talking about that, I'm like, what am I missing out on? And it looks like there's a big Wikipedia page. So, what was the question?
Did you ever have a period in your life where you actually thought like girls are icky and I should stay away from them? Because I've always thought that was just like a game for some reason.
You're asking me if I remember my childhood.
Whoops, that's my first mistake.
Well, that sort of rings true. I mean, certainly it's presented enough in TV.
Yeah, but when has Hollywood ever lied to us?
I feel like it's the kind of thing that I probably acted like I believed, but I don't know if 10-year-old Stephen could probably be said to have beliefs.
Right.
So I think I just did stuff.
Yeah, all the boys around me would do that, and so I joined in, but now I'm wondering, is that just literally everybody in the entire world?
But the important part is sort of, child psychologists would say, oh, your gender identity is the thing that makes you do what all the boys are doing rather than do what all the girls are doing.
Well,
Um,
okay. That was just because that was what the other boys were doing.
yes, but then there are some boys who do what all the girls are doing, and
Hmm.
not what all the boys are doing. And what's going on with that? And for instance, the girls, they don't do what all the boys are doing; they do what all the girls are doing.
Yeah.
So there's sort of the developmental psychology concept, right?
Hmm.
I'm not sure I'm a big fan of it because it's sort of very blank slatist, but that's a whole thing for another discussion. Though I've become closer to gender blank slatism over time as I've learned things. So I mean I'm very not blank slatist, but I think that there are some cases where it's worth thinking about it that way.
It seems to me that starting just from my own experience, but then fortunately being very gratified by Ayla's polls, I believe like the majority of humans just don't really have much of a gender, just gender blank slatism, and slot into the roles that are assigned. And then there's a few people on the fringes of either sex that are like, oh yeah, no, I'm totally this gender, and they
So
kind of set the rails for everyone else.
I don't think that's correct. So actually,
No?
one of the things that got me started on the whole research thing was that because now we get into some of the other kinds of gender identity too, like do you want to be a man and so on, right? One of the things that got me started on was a poll on Less Wrong that asked about a concept called cis by default, right? So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
idea,
That's what's we were talking about more or less.
yeah.
That's just by default idea, or also, which is basically just the idea that everyone is agender, more or less.
So what the polls on Less Wrong tended to find, and also polls on other places, I think, they tended to find that it was more like 50-50.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's more
and
than I was
yeah,
expecting.
and then there are also various studies where boys have been raised as girls for various reasons. There are basically two reasons that has happened. So there was one time where a circumcision went very wrong. His penis was I can't remember how badly it was, but I think it was like basically destroyed. So they went,
Mm.
oh, a boy without a penis, that's basically a girl, right? So let's
How can you tell the difference, right?
right. So they went and decided that they should raise him as a girl, and that went terribly wrong. But then there are people who say, oh, maybe the reason it went terribly wrong wasn't because of anything innate. Maybe it was because the doctor made the boy do sex play with his brother, and that seems
Wait,
like a
what?
right. So that's a giant sort of bizarre
Is that
thing.
a thing that happened?
Yes, it's
Wow. Okay, that would fuck people up.
so so um luckily slash unluckily the experiment was tried something like I don't know 20 or 50 more times
Hmm.
on without any of the weird sex play that it's very messed up, but yeah, what they tended to find, so that was with a different condition and then messed up circumcision. That was I don't know what it was, but what they found there was that some proportion of the time, one of the studies said 50% of the time they have a strong masculine identity and reject the rearing. But sort of if you look into it, it's sort of unclear because there were a lot of individuals who so at first it was like I don't know 70 to 80% who were very opposed to being reared as female. They hadn't been told, they just didn't fit in after that, like they had been reared from fairly young, but it
Hmm.
just didn't catch on, right? But then some of those 80%, they then seemed to adapt to it eventually. So
Okay.
after they sort of cooled down, then it was maybe 50-50 or so. But
Okay.
there's questions to be raised about the ones that adapted. Did they truly adapt or did they not? Right? Who knows?
Right.
So I tend to go with it's around 50-50 how strong of an identity people have. So that sort of forms the foundation for much of my research. My theory is, suppose we want to figure out why people are trans, or like why would someone want to be the opposite sex, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
if we notice that among men, there's a huge range where going from all the way to it would be a fate worse than death to be a woman to I think it would be totally cool, like just among ordinary men, then there must be something that makes them go one way or another with regards to feeling this, right? I mean, it's obviously not going to be very important because almost all of them want to be men, even if they don't want to very strongly. But if we think about, okay, what happens if you take these factors that generate all this variation within the normal range and then extend it out to the extreme ranges? Like, for instance, if you take someone who is very autogynephilic and then you add in whatever thing can make non-autogynephilic men go from, oh, being a woman would be the worst, to being a woman would be kind of cool, but also I like being a man, right? Couldn't that take an autogynephile who's sort of on the fence and go all the way to like severe gender dysphoria? Because if you think about it, it's a wide range, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of forms the foundation for my research. And actually, just recently this month, I actually made some significant progress on it, because I recently started a new type of research that makes it much easier to do qualitative studies. So what I found was kind of obvious in retrospect, which is gender conservatism, like the classical macho men who think it's very important to be manly and so on. They
Mm-hmm.
are more satisfied with being male, right? Whereas someone who thinks hey, maybe there are many genders, and the
Mm-hmm.
more gender liberal or gender progressive or whatever, they are much more open to being women. So
Okay.
So of course that then again raises the question of is it causal or not, right? Because you could easily imagine all sorts of things like gender liberalism attracts the sorts of people who would be more gender bendy, right?
Yeah, I would imagine someone who is trans would never be a gender conservative, right?
Well, so there are a lot of trans people, right? So there are definitely some who are gender conservative. It's something I've at times been up in debates about it.
Huh. Okay.
But so anecdotally, I don't know if it's true, but anecdotally, it seems to possibly be more a thing about among the homosexual transsexuals, the more feminine ones who are attracted to men and so on, right?
Mm-hmm. They
Uh,
are more gender conservative or more gender liberal?
More gender conservative, anecdotally. I mean,
Oh, okay.
but I don't know. But then the question is it causal or not, right? So I think there are reasons to believe it to be causal. So the simplest one was, a lot of this came from a qualitative study, right? Like I asked men who were, very to one end or another with the gender identity, like men who were like, I would like to try being a woman, versus men who were very conservative. And they were the ones who sort of gave out, oh, I think it's because of my political beliefs, right? So it's not like they said, I have joined conservatives because I am a very strong male. Of course, the trouble is then I'm relying on their inference. I have no idea how they made the inference that this is the reason, right? So if we wanted to
Right.
further substantiate this, then we should zoom in and ask and study closer. How did they actually arrive at that conclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are other reasons to believe that it's causal. One of them is that gender progressivism wasn't really correlated with autogynephilia. If autogynephilia causes you to want to be a woman, and wanting to be a woman just then causes you to be gender progressive, then autogynephile should also be gender progressive. If you think about the effect sizes, then actually it's kind of hard to detect. It's a whole deal, right?
What is the takeaway here, that AGP is not influenced by gender conservatism?
AGP seem to be independent of gender conservatism. And my thought is that if AGP and gender conservatism are roughly independent, but both correlate to gender identity, then the simplest way you would end up with that situation would be if both of them are causes of gender identity. Actually, this leads to a fun thing, which is I used to weigh this simplicity point very highly, right? Because Occam's razor, like that's what you're supposed to do as a rationalist, right?
Yeah.
But the trouble is, you don't actually need to add very much complexity before you get a totally different theory. And if you think about it, in social science, is anything truly simple? Like, surely there's a lot of different things going on in people's lives. So I actually no longer think that
So basically, gender identity is complicated, and you don't have a simple answer to it.
Well, so I think there are some reasons beyond that to believe it's causal, and that is that I think causality tends to go from the most varied thing to the less varied thing, right? Like, if you have some factor that's much bigger than anything else, then it has many more opportunities to affect things, right? And now, if you think about politics, right? Like, people have this giant tribalism thing, and values, and politics is in a sense this giant thing. It's not necessarily the thing that one would notice as being a giant thing, but it is this giant thing.
So gender identity is strongly influenced by your politics is a major takeaway.
That would be my takeaway, and that's sort of the big progress I've made recently.
Huh. Okay.
So, sort of the reason I think it's a big piece of progress is because it actually answers my original question of why are nerds so trans? Because nerds are much more gender progressive.
Oh, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to agree with that. It's nice things about nerds.
Yeah.
so in a sense, I'm done. I managed to do it.
Yeah. You have found the answer, and now you can retire to Haiti or something.
Yes.
Or Fiji.
Yeah. So there's actually a funny thing, because people thought that autogynephilia was closely related to nerdiness, right? Because there are so many nerdy trans women. But now I think, because people have then tried to study, is autogynephilia related to nerdiness? And they haven't been able to come up with much. And now we actually have an explanation for why they wouldn't come up with much. Because autogynephilia and nerdiness, maybe they're just independent. And you just thought they were related because nerdiness and gender progressivism are related.
That is pretty darn brilliant, and I like it, and we really should be wrapping up here soon. Stephen, is there anything you wanted to ask or comment on before we wrapped up?
No, I mean, I was quiet for most of that. Like I said, it's kind of just, I didn't have any preconceived thoughts on this. This is the first time I knew what AGP stood for. There were a handful of times where people talked about like different camps of whatever sides of this dispute or something, and they would be like, oh yeah, Blanchard-ists or whatever-ists. And I guess, is this just me, or is like when you label something as like a scientist name /ist or -ist, isn't that like a sign of an underdeveloped field of study? Like you don't say that person's an Einsteinist or a Newtonian or a Newtonist or whatever, right?
I mean, you do talk a lot about the study of Newtonian mechanics, and
but you don't call somebody a Newtonist. You know what I mean?
Well, we do kind of sometimes refer to people as Bayesians, so
that is also true.
My other thought on that was like Darwinist isn't like a real word unless like you're a creationist name calling an evolutionary scientist.
I mean, there was like the Darwinian evolution.
There was.
I mean,
that was when it was underdeveloped, right? I think I'm kind of talking out my ass here. To me that like
I mean, some people like it, some people don't like it, right? I find it helpful to have the term, but then we end up with weird terms like post neo Blanchardian and things like that. So it's like,
I think if you ever post neo anybody, you're past that field of science, or like you're past that whatever the position was. that could be that'll be the stand I take.
So Blanchardians are the ones that believe AGP actually does exist, which is good for them, but for some reason don't believe that women can have any kinks. So, I guess just take the good stuff from any given field.
It's sort of complicated, because then they will say, oh, actually women can have kinks if society makes them have it, and weird things like that. Like, there's a whole thing. But yeah,
it seems strange to try to break down kinks of innate versus learned, because I mean, isn't there a whole lot of overlap in there?
I think Blanchard would agree with that.
Okay, so a bunch of interesting things to learn from a bunch of interesting groups, and don't marry yourself to any particular ideology, I guess.
And if people really want to know about this stuff, where can they find work that you've done, or where do you write stuff?
In theory, I have a blog. I don't post super often to it, but it's called surveyanon.wordpress.com. I think you're able to add links below the podcast, so I will get you the links. And then I hang out in some discords, including in the Bayesian conspiracy Discord, so you can talk with me there.
Excellent.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on and diving into this stuff. It's interesting. Like I said, as someone who hadn't heard of it, I felt like I was out of my depth, but it made for good listening. So,
yeah,
that's good.
I guess people transition for a number of reasons, and we just should not care why and let them transition if they want to transition, right?
Well, that's that's of course a big debate on its own, right?
Why is that a big debate?
I would tend to agree with you here, right? I guess you could invite Zach Davis on because he has a bunch of thoughts about not necessarily that people shouldn't transition, but that there are some problems that appear, and I think he has thought more about those problems than I have.
I mean, I think there's definitely downsides to transitioning. There's, like I said, a good reason I haven't, but if people decide they like the upsides more than the downsides, let them go at it.
Well, I think when you say don't care, we shouldn't care why. Like, I think Jay said it really well. Like, if you're just going to make up a reason and say that publicly about why people are doing something, and then as long as you let them do it, like, it doesn't matter. I feel like that's a weird stance to take. Like, there's a stigma that can attach. Like, if you were to say, why do women get abortions? Because they love killing babies. But actually, I think if we just let them do it, they're just a bunch of baby murdering psychopaths, right? So, like, what I'm saying is, I don't think that letting them do it is like, a green light to say, well, we can just make up whatever justification we want about it, right? Why don't we just ask people?
Yes, I guess, but a lot of people have different answers, and I like killing babies is a bad reason to do things, but like, I would like to be a woman, I find it erotic is not a bad reason for doing something. So if it isn't hurting other people, what's the big deal?
I guess I wasn't sure who we were asking, opinion on stuff, like if someone's doing it from the outside or from the inside, but I think we kind of went into this a bit earlier, so no, that's funny though.
It sort of opens a whole rabbit hole. Like in total, I agree with you, but I think that there's a lot of things like because you wanted to sort of wrap it up, right? There are a lot of complexities, where other people also get affected, and who pays for it, and all those things become big political debates. And overall, I agree with you that it should be allowed and so on. But I think that there are people who have points about how things are set up currently, right? Like there's a whole, women's sports, and if you have sex with someone as a trans person, should you then have to tell them that you're trans and so on?
Isn't it actually usually pretty obvious once you're having sex with them?
Well, I think for most trans people, probably yes, but there are exceptions, and I'm trying to sort of not go into too much detail because it's sort of a huge can of worms to open.
Yeah.
It's sort of like with the autogynephilia thing, right? Like you thought, oh, it's simple enough, right? But then it turns out that there are all these other things, right?
I can understand why people wouldn't want to pay from the public purse for someone who is not feeling great emotional distress, right? Like if you aren't suffering from gender dysphoria.
Right. And that's sort of also where the controversy comes in, because, autogynephilic trans women would generally say that they feel gender dysphoria, right? If this does not get appropriately taken into account when you make these sorts of discussions, right, then, it gets controversial. And, then people say, they lie, and, it becomes a giant thing, right?
I think in general that's not for the public to decide. It's for the person's doctor to or psychiatrist or whatever to be like, no, in my professional opinion, this person actually suffers a lot of distress that they are suffering because of this condition, and therefore we trust the doctor do what they recommend.
That's sort of the that's sort of the common Blanchardian position on it. Like I think Blanchard would agree with you with that, on Bailey would. Of course, that's not the common position by the trans community, right? Because they tend to favor self-identity as the deciding factor.
Well, I mean, if you if you don't suffer a lot of distress, I can totally see, if you have the money for it, do it. I've had cosmetic surgeries and I love the effects, but they weren't paid for by other people, and I think that's fine. That's the way it should be, maybe.
But I could sort of agree with this, right? But then you run into, a lot of people who talk about these theories, right? They don't like to make distinctions, right? They don't like to say, oh, there's some autogynephiles who are one way and some who are another way. So,
but those people are just burying their head in the sand. Like, obviously, there's some people who would like this, but it isn't distressful to them. Like, for example, myself.
The problem is that many of the people who bury their heads in the sand, they are the ones who are delivering the treatment. And, yes, a lot of things are very dysfunctional. And
is that why it's not okay to talk about AGP? Because then some people wouldn't have their transition covered because they don't feel distress?
No, I don't think that's the reason. So I mean, one of the big people who sort of have gone after people who have talked about AGP, she had her children taken away in court.
Oh, Jesus.
I don't think she did anything abusive. I mean, I haven't looked into the case in detail, but I haven't heard any credible claims that she did anything abusive. Even there's a long history of crazy stuff in this area, and the crazy stuff seems to happen on all sides.
That's pretty fucked up. I don't know. I like knowing things that are true, and I think it's always bad to censor things that are true. Like, male AGP exists is not a thing that should be censored because it's kind of obvious.
I don't think that this is so much the thing that gets censored. I mean, technically it does, but I have not had much problem talking about that. The part where it becomes problematic is when one then starts having all of these, stronger theories asserting, all the trans women are in denial about AGP and so on.
Oh, well, I think that's
well,
then someone would need to provide evidence of that, because I'm sure we all know people who are not that way as well.
So the thing is, there are studies, things like, Blanchard studies found that 80% of trans women who were attracted to women had become aroused while wearing women's clothes.
Okay.
So there are some statistics on it, and then how do these statistics relate to, for instance, modern day stuff and to other forms of AGP?
But that doesn't address how much distress they feel at being male,
right? So I think trans women generally, including AGP trans women, generally feel a lot of distress about being male. I mean, I certainly do, but you apparently don't do, right? So there's an interesting question of, what is the distinction? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I dislike being this particular sex, but again, it's not something that is so bad that I need to change my entire biology to deal with it.
And of course, that's also where you get problems, right? Because then if something is to an extent continuous, then where do you set the line? And if a doctor does set the line one place, then another doctor might set it in another place, and then you could go shopping for sympathetic doctors, and it's a whole big can of worms that gets very complicated.
I see.
So actually, that's sort of part of the trouble. So there's sort of an easy shelling point where you just say, you are ultra restrictive with transitions, right? And then there's an easy shelling point where you say, oh, you are very open and make it easy to transition, right? And then it's hard to find a well justified balance in between these two extreme points. You can sort of do it if you have someone who is sort of committed to it, right? But it's not necessarily something that automatically happens as a result of you picking some simple value that everyone can agree on.
I mean, I still like the idea that if it's being paid for publicly, then a doctor has to approve that, this is treating something. But if it's something you're paying for yourself, there's absolutely no restrictions of any kind. It's your money, it's your body, do whatever you want.
I mean,
does that seem unreasonable?
I mean, I think a lot of the unreasonability comes down to the approval process. I mean, so for instance,
I don't think there should be any approval process for something that's self-funded.
For instance, Ray Blanchard had a rule that you had to have real life experience for 2 years before you could get anything. So for 2 years you have to dress as a woman and go live on your life as a woman before you get hormones or surgery or anything.
Oh, damn. That's kind of fucked up.
Well, that would be one approval process, right? And
Right.
you agree that's fucked up, right? So what should
Yeah.
you use instead, right? That's sort of the big question, right? And some people think that this is a reasonable approval process because it guarantees that you don't get regrets, and but I would agree that it's pretty extreme, right? But what do you
Yeah.
want to do instead, right? So
Yeah. Well, I guess that's where the fight is being fought right now.
Yeah.
I'm just glad that we are getting some more actual light shown on what is the situation on the ground, what facts actually exist, as opposed to just what would we prefer to be true. And once we know what actually is true, then we can fight with some map of what we're fighting over, as opposed to random flailings at each other and exerting sheer political powers.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure how much progress people will make on getting a good map, but I guess we'll see. I mean, obviously, I've done some things, but
You're chipping away at that too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. If we have any follow-up questions, I will contact you and see if I can drop your answers into our next feedback section.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again for your time.
Yes, no problem. See you.
Okay. Well, we are back, and we are going to do the less wrong posts. Yes.
That sounds like a good plan to me.
Cool.
Oh, but first,
yes.
Quick feedback from Townsend Cooper on Patreon. So regarding Georgia's land taxes, I was struggling to come up with ideas of like renting undeveloped land.
Mhm.
And there was a fun example of, or two of them, grazing rights and hunting leases.
Yeah.
And so apparently people pay to graze their animals on undeveloped land. And like people who own undeveloped land also have hunting rights. And so, if you own a ton of acreage, I guess you can rent out parts of it or give some license. I'm sure you have to coordinate with whatever state boards or something. Let me just read this thing here. It says, people pay to graze their animals on undeveloped land and also have hunting rights for certain seasons of the year. This is extremely common in rural America, especially with respect to grazing rights. This can get quite complex as there's interaction between land values that vary for entirely unrelated reasons, animal feed prices, beef prices, and weather, among other factors. I graze my animals on my own land, so this is about as much as I know about it, but I know it's a big issue out here.
Neat.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That is an actual use of land that you don't do fuck all with. I love it. And it's a smart use of it.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even land that, like the Sahara, that you don't do anything with, you could put solar panels on now, I guess.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Love it.
All right. Well, shall we get into the less wrong posts now then?
Let's do it.
Okay. It is Evo Psych Week. So the first post is rational versus scientific Ev Psych. He just says Ev Psych. I believe now everyone has kind of defaulted to calling it Evo Psych because it's easier to say.
It definitely is.
Yes. But anyways, he relates about this time that he was looking in the fridge, waiting for the ketchup to jump in front of him, and then came up with this idea that men are hunters. So if we, in the ancestral environment, men are hunters. So if we can't find our prey, we instinctively freeze motionless and wait for it to wander into our field of vision. Women are gatherers, so they move things around and look behind them. This seemed like very much the kind of lol Evo Psych sort of thing that people lol at nowadays.
Yeah.
Do you concur?
I mean, yeah, but to be fair, or to be clear, rather. Mm-hmm. So he says, this is the sort of just so story that people make up and get criticized for. And he says,
yes,
well, fine.
He wasn't.
But he says, well, fine, but I bet it's still true. I have no idea why he's confident in that.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is one of the weakest explanations I can imagine. Like, I think his mom probably has more experience looking for shit she can't find because she's older. Right?
Yeah.
So she moves stuff in the fridge, or she put it there.
Right.
Like maybe there's more evidence than he has from this one story, but if I was trying to explain this one incident of me staring vacantly at the fridge and somebody comes up and be like, oh, it's behind this, I would assume that they put it there before I assumed going back 80,000 years of, generations of hominids hunting on the savannah, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of amazed that he took this and he even said, well, fine, but I bet it's still true. What he should have said is, well, fine, but I bet I can make a case for it.
Right. I mean, the rest of the post is very interesting, but the fact that he goes with, I bet it's still true, made me scratch my head.
I'm glad it wasn't just me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe he has updated on that position, or maybe he has found compelling new evidence that backs him up.
I hope he's right. Like that.
Really?
Yeah. Just because, like, for as far as I'm concerned, he shouldn't be. Like, that makes no sense.
Right.
And so it would be funny if he was.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. All right.
So he pulled out this thing, which I thought was a cool point. It's kind of long, but I'll try to read it fast. There's some people who will, if you just tell them the refrigerator hypothesis, and snort and say that's an untestable just so story and dismiss it out of hand. But if you start telling them about the idea of the gaze tracking experiment and explain the evolutionary motivation, he had a whole experimental setup that you could do to test if this is actually a thing or not, or at least in theory, this was like an idea that you could test with this gaze tracking thing. He said they will say, that might be right, because then, you see, you are proposing a scientific hypothesis. In the earlier case, you were just making up a story without testing it, which is very unscientific. We all know that scientific hypotheses are more likely to be true than unscientific ones. If you have a hypothesis you have not figured out how to test with an organized, rigorous experiment, then your hypothesis is not scientific. When you figure out how to do an experiment, and more importantly, set out to do the experiment, then your hypothesis becomes scientific indeed. You are judging probabilities using the affect heuristic, and you know that science is a good thing, then making the jump from merely rational to scientific might seem to raise the probability. And this is where I thought he had a good point, because really nothing has changed. Like, first someone came up with a crazy I'm looking for the ketchup to jump in front of me idea, and people say that's dumb. And then he comes up with like, well, but hold on, here's a way you could possibly test that. And then if someone were to say, okay, that seems more scientific, so it seems to be more likely. Like, all that was done was someone proposed a way to test it. That shouldn't change the likelihood of how likely it is to be true, right?
I'm glad that you hit that point, because as I was thinking about it again, because my first read, I'm like, well, of course, being able to test it raises the reasonableness of believing in it, right? But I think I maybe it was affect heuristicing, or maybe I was just not properly grokking what he was saying here. So what he's saying is like, all right, I've got proposition A. Does it sound reasonable? And then I've got proposition A. Here's how I would test it. And people would judge the second situation as more likely than the first, even though you've got the same proposition.
Yeah.
So the proposition is the same level of reasonableness based on whether or not you can test it. I suppose that makes sense. What you could say, though, is that, it is like, I think what I would say to this is like, not that it's scientific. In fact, I find the idea of this study I don't think it would bear any fruit. But what I could say is like, okay, that is a reasonable thing to investigate. That's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. I could see maybe it, being more interesting once you start thinking of ways to test it, because that's just kind of like an inherently interesting mental exercise. But I do think that this may be a thing that made people lend more credence to stuff, just because it is now suddenly associated with scientism, whatever, that it makes it seem more reasonable for no good reason. And maybe that's like why both EvoPsych caught on with some people, and also why it got a bad name, because just making up a story about like, oh, this might be why this is true, shouldn't really change how likely something is to be true or not. And therefore, people who are swayed by like, oh, this might be true because this maybe happened in an ancestral environment, would become very annoying to people very soon, very quickly, right?
Yeah, I have to imagine that EvoPsych caught on because on the one hand, it's intriguing. Oh look, we can explain some of our behaviors by extrapolating what we think our ancestors might have been motivated to do. There's something kind of capturing about that, right? And then I could see it getting derided because you can't test any of this stuff. You can't go grab 100 of our ancient ancestors and do science at them. So I could see how like very hard, whatever Popperian scientists maybe might draw contention with that.
Well, also, like, someone could say something like, well, women are shorter because when they gave birth, the baby didn't have as far to fall if they were shorter, so it was more likely to survive the birth. And then if someone said, oh, yeah, I guess so, that's a good point. Like, soon people would really start to roll their eyes at any Evo Psych explanation, because making up a story shouldn't convince you of something that you can just measure in the real world whether it's true or not, that this is a thing that happens when women give birth, if babies suffer concussions or not, based on the tallness of a woman.
Also, that's not psychology, right?
Right.
But,
Yeah,
but
that's
no,
a good point.
But point taken. I mean, my first thought was like, I'd like to show you the giraffe, where
Yeah.
its first experience of being alive, or I guess being born, is like the 3-foot drop to the ground, because the mom,
Is it really?
the mom does give birth standing up,
Awesome.
whereas humans don't. Yeah, that's it's interesting. I think there's a lot to be found. I think it's nice to think through an evolutionary lens, but like as the I guess zooming out, thinking about it, maybe those will come up in the next reading too. But I don't know, like other than maybe signaling justifications, status hierarchy stuff. What sort of things that like I think about with evolutionary psychology that actually bears any fruit in my real life? But
I mean, I guess the hunter versus gatherer distinction is probably a big one, but it's always hard to say what effect that would really have, right?
yeah,
Like, does it make any sense to say that since, men were generally the hunters and women were gatherers, therefore men would have an instinct to freeze and wait for game to walk by? I'm not sure if that holds at all. And if it did, I'm not sure that would relate in any way to looking in a refrigerator.
yeah, there's so many jumps there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious that we evolved like all species do, and we have some idea of what the ancestral environment was like, but it's too easy, like a lot of people have said, to make up stories that seem right, but then turn out not to have anything to do with anything.
Yeah, like I notice right now that I'm furrowing my brow when I'm thinking about this. One reason that we have eyebrows is to keep shit from falling in our eyes, right?
That's what I've heard.
But I'm sure eyebrows are largely for expressive purposes. Eyelashes help keep stuff out of your eyes too. But I guess I'm thinking like, oh, I can invent stories as to why I'm making this facial expression. But honestly, they're all just stories.
Right.
And I don't know if I made up two, which one I would call more reasonable. Well, unless I made one really stupid, right?
Yeah.
So
I think mainly we should let Evo Psych be done by the actual evolutionary psychologists out there, who probably hang their heads in shame and groan loudly whenever lay people try to do stuff and say things like, that's not how Evo Psych works, stop making us look dumb.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
The post also says, figuring out a way to test a belief with an organized, rigorous, repeatable experiment is certainly a good thing, but it should not raise the belief's rational probability in advance of the experiment succeeding. Which is, yeah, many agrees. Thumbs up.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. That I'm glad you, like I said, glad you hit that twice, because that is a really cool kind of inversion of thinking. Because to me, my first thought is like, well, of course it does, and they're like, wait a minute, no, it doesn't. Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
At least it was for me the minute I had that realization. So
I think one of the really cool things at the very end here is he kind of does a judo flip at the end, where he says that conversely, also, if someone makes a evolutionary just so story and you cannot figure out how to test it in any organized, rigorous, repeatable way, nonetheless, it may have a substantial rational credibility, equaling the degree that you would expect a experiment to succeed if you could just figure out some way to do such an experiment. Which was, it's neat the way he says, like, just like if you can think of an experiment, it shouldn't raise your probability estimate. Also, if you can't think of a way to experimentally test it, that shouldn't decrease your probability estimate. It's just as reasonable beforehand, even despite the fact that we don't have the tools to test it. I'm like, that's a weird, interesting point. Okay.
And it follows. It's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I think in my head, I was conflating like reasonableness in believing and probability of being true. Wait, hold on. Those are the same. I was thinking of, I don't know. No, I can't articulate it. But yeah, I guess, if someone is like, oh, I've got this really cool idea and I can't give you any idea of how to test it, like, oh, I guess what I was thinking was, the difference between how good of an experiment I can design or how good of a story I can tell as to why this might be the case, right? Like if I'm trying to think of some convoluted thing involving, ice melting in my car or something, right? Like, I don't know, line up a bunch of random stuff, like nature, right?
It gets infused with phlogiston while it's in your car because your car has a high phlogiston concentration.
Well, I'm thinking like if I don't know, whatever, an icicle melted and fell and broke the windshield or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I couldn't test that. All the evidence is gone because I came home a week later, right?
Yeah.
But it's a much better explanation than like a small meteorite hit it, right? Just because it's way less, it's way more likely, right?
Yeah.
So, just because you can't test something doesn't mean that like some explanations aren't better than others.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I can dig it.
Cool.
All right, what's our failed just so story?
A failed just so story is the next Less Wrong post, and it's basically him saying that people said that faith. There's a just so story for why religion and faith exists, and it's that religion helps groups outcompete other groups, and faith helps religions be strong. And he is very much in opposed to the idea that group selection in humans is a strong driver of human evolution. He points to the fact that humans have an equal split of male and female people being born as evidence of that. And so he said that faith, it's a failed just so story for why faith exists. He says, if faith is a true religious adaptation, I don't see why it's even puzzling what the selection pressure could have been. Heretics were routinely burned alive just a few centuries ago. Like, you don't need the selection pressure of group selections. All you need is the selection pressure of people without adequate faith were killed.
Yeah, I think that the idea that people were more likely to fight for their gods than they were for nothing, so they won in conflicts. That's not an explanation with a lot of explanatory power.
Mm-hmm.
Like Dan Dennett postulates the hyperactive agency detection software.
Mm-hmm.
So like the example I remember him giving in one of his books was like you're sitting reading a book and like some snow falls outside the window and your dog perks up and it's like, who's that? Who's there? Right? Mm-hmm. And the dog is like, oh, nobody, I'll stop. But the person can sit there and imagine, oh, something knocked that off. Must be like the snow god, right? And it could be and modeling events as agents you can make an argument for why that might be adaptive, right?
Right.
So at least there he's able to lay out like a chain of reasoning that I'm like, okay, at least that makes some sense. I could follow that for longer than I can follow they won more wars, right?
Yeah. Since this was there was nothing else for me to pull out of here, so I also pulled out Robin Hansen's quotes. Quote, a reply near the bottom where he said, "There's a lot of good stories about individual fitness advantages from religion that have nothing to do with burning heretics at the stake," which I thought was, a darn good point. And he didn't go into more details, but I believe we are all pretty much familiar with them already.
Give me one example.
Neighbors are more likely to help you and trust you if you are of their religion.
There you go. I like it. Yeah, I mean, if you pay this costly price to signal your affiliation to the group, you're more likely to actually be part of that group, right?
Yeah.
So when you come next door, be like, "Can I borrow some money or some food?" They'll be like, "Well, I see that you stabbed holes through your hands like the rest of us. You must really care, right? Of course, you can borrow some food.
You're a good Christian hand stabber,
right?" All right, I'm into it.
Yeah. All right. For next week, our 2 Less Wrong posts are, but there's still a chance, right? And the fallacy of Gray.
Love it. Not to be confused with friend of the show, Gray.
No, they're very different people. He may have a phallus, but he's not a fallacy.
On that note, do you want to give a patron a shout out for they can be the one responsible for bringing that pun to your ears this fortnight?
Sure. Luis Campos, thank you for being one of our patrons and helping us produce this show and getting it out to the people. Hopefully we have helped clear up some things that people didn't want to say or didn't know, and we can have policy discussions about real, true world stuff, and you have helped do that for everybody.
Or maybe things are
Boy,
more
that
confusing
was-
now. Alternate pronunciations
Man.
could be Louis or Louis on that first name. So
Yeah.
anyway,
So
high five. Thanks a lot.
thank you, Louis. I'm sorry I'm semi-coherent. I'm just getting over a cold, I think, and it's been a bit draining. So
Oh, you're nailing it, dude. Don't worry.
okay.
Yeah.
My apologies.
It's funny, Eneasz, like on a bad day is like me on a good day.
Nah, I wouldn't go that far.
Well, you're not coming off half as incoherent as I think you are, or as you think you are. See, I can't do this.
Nice.
All right.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again, Luis Campos, for being this week's hero. And we will see you all in 2 weeks.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Bye. Well, no, excuse me. Apparently, I'm going to have to edit that out.
Nice.
My bad.